So in the last few lessons, we looked at implementing source control locally using the command line as well as using Xcode, and also remotely using GitHub. So now I want to take you a little bit further, and I want to talk about collaboration using remote repositories and GitHub, because this is one of the best ways to start working in a team of programmers and to contribute your skills to open source projects. So we've seen all of these four areas: the working directory, the staging area, the local repository, as well as the remote repository. And you should be pretty familiar with all four of these areas by now. Now, in the next scenario, let's shift over to just look at the local and remote repository that you own. So let's say that Angela, so myself, I own this repository. I created it locally and then I pushed it to my remote repository on GitHub. Now, let's say that I have an evil twin who's called, I don't know, Bangela. That's a terrible name. Let's say that she also wanted to make changes to my repository. She's looking at my code base and, she wants to add some features or fix some bugs or do something. Now, because I own this remote repository over here, in order for her to work on it, she could make a copy of it that exists on her GitHub account. So remember, this is different from Git clone. Git clone is just grabbing the entirety of the repository and then cloning it to your local work environment. Now, in this case, we're basically just copying a repository that's hosted on GitHub, and we're keeping the copy under our own GitHub account where we can make changes to it. So this, in terms of GitHub lingo, is called forking. Now, once you've forked a remote repository, then you now own it. You have full permissions to do whatever it is that you like with this copy of the repository. Because as you can imagine, it would be pretty crazy if everybody could modify your source code on all of your open source repositories. Because, it would lead to maybe amateurs changing all sorts of things that you don't want them to, or, people making features that are incompatible with what you've got already. Basically, you would only give people who you have a trusting relationship with right access to your remote repository. So say if you worked within a team and you're all working on a product, then everybody in the team probably has both read and write permissions on a single remote repository. And that way they can git clone and work on it locally and then push it and resolve any sort of conflicts that way. But you don't want anybody on the internet having those kind of permissions. So how do you implement this kind of open source collaboration then? Well, it's through forking and making pull requests. So now let's say that evil Bangela, has forked my repository. So on her GitHub account, she now owns a copy of my repository. And from this point, she can then clone that repository to work on it locally. And if she decides to add some features to it, maybe, improve the code base or add some more code or do something crazy or whatever it is that she wants, then after she's happy with that and she's committed those changes, then she can push it to her remote repository. And then if she wants me, or good Angela, to incorporate those changes that she made, then her only option is to make a pull request if she is not within that trusted pool of people who all have read and write access to my remote repository. So say if she only has read access, then she would have to make a pull request. And it's almost like making a suggestion. Here are some suggested changes that I've been working on. What do you think about it? If you okay it, then please, merge it to your remote repository. So the reason why it's called a pull request and not a push request is because the person who has the write permission to the repository, so I have write permission to my own remote repository, which has been forked and duplicated by, my evil twin. If she wants to incorporate those changes, then I have the deciding vote. So I can review those changes and I can pull the changes over. So it's not a push because you don't own the rights to the remote repository that you're trying to push to. in this case, if I decide after a code review that actually those features that she added were pretty great and it seems compatible with my code so far and doesn't break anything, then I would approve the pull request and merge her repository with my own. So the changes will be reflected in a new commit. So let's take a look at this in action. So here we've got our original story repository. So this is a remote repository, remember, because it's hosted online on GitHub. And we've got a number of commits, and we've been doing some modifications and writing to write our storyline. Now I'm going to log out of my account. So that was the account that created the story. And then I'm going to sign in using a different account. So right now I'm signed into a different GitHub account. This account is named Guilfoyle is my other name. And now I'm going to search for that repository. So I found the story repository by the user Angela Bauer. So that was the one that we saw earlier on. So I'm going to go into this repository, and you can see that all of these lines and files are publicly visible, and you can read through all of it, even though you are now not signed in to the account that created this repository. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fork this repository. So as we mentioned before, forking is simply making a copy or a duplicate of a remote repository and putting it under your own GitHub account. So you can see this user that I've created is called Guilfoyle is my other name. And now I have this repository under my own username. So I've made a copy of it. And you can see it's exactly the same as before. Everything's been copied over, including all of the previous commits that were made. So now from here, I'm going to make some changes. So let's maybe change one of these storylines. So let's change chapter 4. So let's say that this other user, this other person, it has some suggested improvements to my code, or in this case, to my writing. They're still keeping the spirit of the original repository alive because we are now converting into a space theme or an alien theme. So I've made my changes to chapter 4, and I'm going to commit those changes saying add more space theme to chapter 4. So that's what I did, and I'm going to commit to the master branch. So this is the master branch of my own forked copy of the story repository. So once I commit those changes, then we can view what it currently looks like under the graphs. So if we have a look at the network, you can see that this is the point where I forked the story repository. And that commit was created by Angela Yu, which basically merged this branch to the master branch. So we did that 2 lessons back, if you remember. So the latest commit, though, is made by this current user, Guilfoyle is my other name, and you can see that I've added it to the master branch of my forked copy of that repository. So say if I now open up a incognito window and I log back in to the Angela account and go over to that story repository, you can see that if I have a look inside my graphs, go into network, that latest change, it's not reflected on my master branch. It's showing up as a separate branch made by Guilfoyle is my other name. And you can see the members who have forked your repository. So this is a great way of collaborating because you can have contributors make edits or add new features to your pre-existing code base or repository. And now what I can do, if I head back to the Guilfoyle account, so I'm just going to flip through these two so that you can see. Right now I'm inside the Guilfoyle account, and this is the Angela Bauer account. So now under the Guilfoyle account, what I can do is I can make a pull request. So we can do that here, and you can see that it's able to merge And these are the changes. So swapping that word for that word, swapping that word for that phrase. So now all I have to do is hit create pull request and tell the original author, which is Angela Bower, what I've done, why I think my modifications or my features are worthy to be merged with the original repository, and any other notes, right? Any other comments that I have. Let's just say, always helps to be complimentary. So now let's go ahead and create a pull request. So the pull request is done, but if we have a look back into the story repository, you can see that those changes are not made, right? It's because I don't own this repository. I don't have write access. I only have read access as a member of the general public and not a member of the trusted inner circle. So I can only suggest my changes. Now, if we head over back to the Angela Bower account, who owns this repository, now if I have a look under pull requests, I've got a brand new pull request, right? So it previously was 0, but now I have 1, and it's showing as 1 open pull request. And this is added a minute ago by Guilfoyle. And if I look at it, I can see why he thinks that this modification is necessary and what were his commit message. And I can also take a look at the commits that he made and compare the differences. So review those changes. So I could say something like, great job, Guilfoyle. And I can submit this feedback to Guilfoyle and approve merging these changes. So now all I have to do is hit merge pull request and maybe add a merged from Guilfoyle's modifications to chapter 4. Okay, so let's go ahead and confirm the merge. And now you can see that that commit is added to Angela Bower master. So if I have a look inside my graphs now, you can see that the latest commit was my merge, and you can see where it came from. It came from a fork made by Guilfoyle, which shows up as a separate branch, and then it got merged back into the main branch of the main repository. So some people use GitHub purely as version control for their own projects, and use some of the features that we discussed in previous lessons. But there's also a huge community of awesome coders on here who have created really brilliant projects. And if you can see ways of improving it or contributing to it, then it's a great way of starting to learn how to work in a team of programmers, which is a really essential skill when you're working for a startup or for a company. So for example, if we have a look at the AlamoFire repository, which is something that we've been using for quite a while, if you have a look at the contributions, you can see that there have been loads and loads of other users who have looked at the code and done things, or made suggestions, and to steadily improve this framework that, everybody else is benefiting off, right? You can see that a total of 4,300 forks have been made, and there's currently 4 open pull requests, but 559 pull requests were closed. So let's have a look. So for example, in this case, this guy updated the README to the current version. So that's obviously just editing a text file, and that's pretty much within anybody's capabilities, right? And then it got merged by somebody who owned this repository, and they gave him a bit of feedback, right? But there's other things like, code additions or code deletions or modifications that people have made. So this guy made some fixes, and He's documented what were the goals, what were the implementation details, what were the tests that he performed. And then the guy who owned the repository said, hey, just, maybe one thing that you need to change, have a look in here. And then once it was changed, then it was approved and merged with the master branch. So have a look around on GitHub and see what are some of the cool projects that you could maybe get involved in. So to begin with, some of these things that we've been using, for example, Progress HUD, right? We've been using inside Quizlet. You can actually have a look inside the code files and see, what are the things that you would change about it. Obviously, Progress HUD is written in Objective-C. Maybe choose one that is written in Swift. But have a look at the libraries that you've been using, and if you want, you can build on top of it, either for your own goals and purposes, but also, if you're building on top of somebody else's open source code, then it's a nice thing to contribute back to the open source world by forking and making a pull request to offer your improvements or bug fixes or new features. So as I said, it's almost like a social network for programmers, and you can make a lot of great friends on here, and you can also get a lot of help on here in your development journey. So the last thing that I wanted to say was that in this module, I've mentioned a lot of different GitHub or Git commands, and it can be quite difficult to remember all of it just by watching these videos once. So remember, you always have these videos, so you can always come back and listen to my terrible jokes, but also the information again, so you can always rewatch it and refresh yourself. But I've actually made a PDF cheat sheet of some of the most common Git and GitHub commands that you'll be using. And I've laid it all out in terms of arrows that we've explained before so that you'll know what I'm talking about. And you can download this PDF inside this lesson. So I hope you enjoyed all of that, and I will see you on the next lesson.